Hey, everybody. Welcome. So glad to have you here with us on Sunday night. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Should be a fun show tonight. Going to talk about a lot of different things. So, yeah, welcome, everybody. And we'll do it. We'll do it. We will do it.
Spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, everybody. So glad to be here with all of you. So, tonight, I actually have some interesting opening remarks. I guess, real quickly, for those of you who are not familiar with the way we do things here, I give my opening remarks. And while I give your opening remarks, I'll be writing down our super chat questions. So, if you have something you want me to talk about, shoot me a super chat question. I give my opening remarks, then we do a roll call. We find out who's on the other side of the camera. I call people out as I see them, names and locations. And then from there, I answer questions for the rest of the night. That's how we do things. So if you have something you want me to talk about, just shoot me a super chat and I will type it. I will type it here on my computer screen. I'll look away from the webcam, look over at the computer screen. As you can all see, I'm in front of the lovely bookshelf, and it should be a good evening. So, yeah, I'll just give my opening remarks. Super chats come in. I'll write them down. And that's the way we'll do it. So, welcome, everybody. So, yeah, we're all kind of recovering from that insane debate with Jason Unruhe, the Maoist rebel. He doesn't like being called Maoist rebel. I'm sorry, we won't call him that. But I almost kind of, I don't know, I didn't feel really great about doing that. Jason, he was somebody who was on the internet doing communist stuff for a long time. And for a long time, I was aware of him. And then as I started increasing my internet presence, as I became a journalist and such, he reached out to me and we were in contact. And then out of the blue, he decided to join with the people that are spreading hate against me. He always had certain very, very antisocial tendencies. I tried to just ignore him and just ignore his provocations and attacks and criticisms. But it got to the point that he was just being so insane and nasty that I ultimately blocked him. And he's continued relentless attacks. And so finally, after a year, I thought, what the heck? This guy really wants to fight with me. He really wants to fight with me. We'll do it. And we did it. Well, you saw it. I mean, I walked all over him. But, I wish it hadn't been this way. That wasn't my goal with Jason. My goal with Jason was not to have a big fight and eventually destroy him on social media. My goal with Jason was to maintain a friendship with somebody who at one point did a lot of very good work. I mean, exposing lies against North Korea. He did DPRK week on his channel. That was pretty awesome. Teaching basic Marxist economics. He used to do some pretty good stuff on his channel, but he always had this antisocial element, and he was never really involved with any actual existing struggles. And for whatever reason, that's what it is. So, I'd say we took a win, but I feel bad about it, and it kind of makes me sad to see somebody who had some real anti-imperialist sentiments. And that's what Jason had. I mean, he was somebody who supported North Korea. He was somebody who opposed U.S. wars. But for whatever reason, he's kind of just degenerated into the communist version of Chris Chan, right? You guys know who Chris Chan is. Chris Chan is a social media, somebody on the internet, a trans person who responds to bullying in a way that makes it worse and responds to provocations. And Jason, for whatever reason, he's somebody who's always responded to provocations and bullying in a way that makes it worse, to the point that it's kind of driven him over the edge. And, I always wanted to be on his side. I remember when I was in leftist circles, when I was still a member of the Workers' World Party, people would bash him. And I'd say, no, I'd say we ought to make videos of our own, and people were always, obsessed with, oh, he's doing this wrong. He's doing this wrong. I'd say, well, let's outdo him, at least he's doing it. So it's really too bad that things have degenerated the way they are, but that's the thing. He didn't want to hold on to a relationship with me. He didn't want to hold on to a friendship with me. He wanted to just get down and dirty. And again, the point that we were arguing about at the end was like a point that, he doesn't even really disagree with me about, which is that communists should advocate a peaceful transition. But if it's not possible, and people have no choice but to defend themselves, that's different. But that triggers him for some reason because he's committed. He just has these violent fantasies. He's got the what do you call it? The airsoft guns. And I mean, it's just like robbing him of the left adventurist, voluntarist fantasy and saying that we want a peaceful transition to socialism. It just angers him a huge amount. And that between he wants to be against America and all of this. And I started out trying to talk sense with him, and you can watch the debate. I don't want to redo it here. I don't want to rehash it here, but it's unfortunate that it's come to this, but it's certainly entertaining. A lot of people watched, which is, I wish I could get other people to watch. I wish I could get the amount of people that watched me rip Jason to shreds. I wish I could get them to watch me, just on here talking about history and politics, on here talking about the Center for Political Innovation. I think that would be better. I don't know why confrontation and tearing apart, creating discord is such a big deal in left-wing circles, because I'd really like to see people coming together. But that kind of brings me to what I wanted to talk about here in my opening remarks tonight. Because discord and disagreement is something that goes on in left-wing circles a lot. And it's something that people are very interested in. But at the same time, we should be striving to do better than this. Your thoughts on Tito's Yugoslavia? All right. All right, wrote it down. But I wanted to talk about this because I've often used the term inside baseball. Are people ever familiar with the term inside baseball? I had a grandfather who was a big baseball fan. My grandfather from Missouri, he was a Southern guy, and he loved baseball. And when I was a kid, I was taller, I grew faster, I guess. So I was tall and skinny. So I remember my grandfather used to call me Slats. He'd say, "Hey, Slats, how you doing there, Slats?" And I didn't realize this, but apparently that was some kind of obscure 1920s, 1930s baseball reference. And if you got my grandfather in the same room with another baseball fan, they would start talking. And I witnessed this a few times. They would start talking, and at first you'd know what they were talking about. You'd know about this team and that team. But then suddenly they'd be talking about obscure baseball rules you never heard of and obscure statistics you never heard of. And thank you very much. And one thing would lead to another. And pretty soon you'd have no idea what the F my grandfather and this other baseball fan were talking about. They would be talking about something that was really, really obscure. And that's what people commonly refer to as inside baseball. It's stuff that if you're not part of that little subculture, if you're not part of that minute group of people who have studied in great depth the details of this stuff, what they're saying is going to sound like gibberish to you. And that one of the things that communists and leftists and socialists should be striving to do is not sound like inside baseball. If I'm going to try and give a speech convincing people that socialism is better than capitalism, convincing people that U.S. imperialism is the main enemy of humanity, I need to do it in a way that as many people as possible can understand what I am saying. And this point is something that I learned from the Marcyite tradition, I think. But it's something I really take to heart, is that when you give a speech as a Marxist, you should assume your audience knows nothing. Why? Because in America, and thank you, in America, when you're talking about socialism and communism, your audience knows nothing. No one in the United States knows anything about communism, about socialism. When I was in school, I was taught that communism means everyone gets paid the exact same wage, no matter how hard they work. I was told that the Soviet Union fell because everyone was getting paid the exact same wage and there was no incentive to work, and so it all just fell apart. I was told that Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto, he wrote, "We want to build a society based on share and share alike." That's not a phrase that's anywhere used in Marxism. People have no clue about any of this stuff. And I have spent my entire life learning this stuff, engaging with this stuff, going internationally to socialist and anti-imperialist and revolutionary countries, being part of revolutionary organizations and anti-imperialist organizations in the United States, studying this stuff in great depth, trying to understand it with the intention, not just of understanding it for myself, but understanding it in a way that it could be communicated to a mass audience. My aim is to be able to explain this. And often when I'm learning a new concept, I will often imagine that I'm explaining it to one of my coworkers or to one of my relatives. I'll go over it in my head as if I'm explaining it to someone who has no idea. And that's a way of making sure you really learn something. If you can learn to explain something, you can really learn it. And in fact, that's one thing that's often been said, is that the best way to learn is to teach. The best way to learn is to teach. And that's why, some Marxist groups, one of the things that they do with new members is they will require them to give a class or lead a discussion on a topic. There was a guy I used to know who had been in a socialist group, and he said that one of the most educational things he did is after he joined this party, they made him give a class on the history of Algeria. And so he spent a couple weeks devouring all the socialist writings on Algeria, discussing Algeria with the older comrades. And by the time he got up in front of his comrades, his group of 10 or 12 people that were in Cleveland, that were the members of this small communist group, and gave a class on Algeria, he knew it backwards and forwards. The best way to learn is to teach. And so we should all be striving in every possible way to speak and explain Marxist ideas in a way that as many people can understand them so they don't sound like inside baseball. That's really important, because if it sounds like inside baseball, only an obscure microcosm of society is going to be able to understand it. Now, that said, the inside baseball is still pretty important. Let me repeat that. The inside baseball is still really important. You may not think that the inside baseball is really important, and it may seem like it's unimportant because so few people know it. But it's actually very important to understand the difference between a Trotskyist and a Maoist and a Marxist-Leninist and a Shachtmanite Trotskyist versus a mainline Trotskyist or a Canonist or a Grantite. To understand these kind of things, to understand the difference between Enver Hoxha and followers of Enver Hoxha and followers of Mao, to understand the difference between various Marxist tendencies in the USA and what they did differently and where their strengths were and where their differences are, this is all really important. It's important because if we're serious about making socialism in the United States, we need to know how other people have done and what other people have tried and why it's worked and why it hasn't worked. We need to know the reason for the different approaches. And if we're serious about building socialism in the world, we need to understand the different countries and their approaches and their differences. So on the one hand, while we want to make things as clear and coherent as possible, every so often, you gotta do some inside baseball. When I published this pamphlet, The Ideological Foundations of the City Building Tendency, I knew it wasn't going to be a wildly popular piece of writing because this is inside baseball. The first essay is an explanation of my interpretation of Marxism and the interpretation of Marxism promoted by the CPI. And the second essay is a critique of Sam Marcy and the Marcyite tendency, which gave birth to the Party of Socialism and Liberation, the PSL, and the Workers' World Party, and some of the splinter groups that have emerged. And this pamphlet this isn't something I could give to my coworkers. This isn't something I could give to my friends, but actually I think I could, because I tried to write it in a way that even if you were highly unfamiliar with these concepts, you could get what I'm trying to say. And that's really important. We want to be doing everything in a mass way, but this inside baseball is really, really important. It's really important. Because if we don't know what we're doing, and we don't know what other people have done, and we don't know how we relate to it, we're not being scientific. If a biologist, went into a laboratory without ever reading any of the literature, any of the published scientific results, and started doing experiments all on his own, he wouldn't have very much success. Part of being involved in scientific work is being familiar with what the rest of the field is doing. And Marxism is scientific. It's not religion. There are no eternal laws that you must do this under all circumstances. No, it's a process of success and failure, trial and error. That's the way these kind of things work. It's understanding the objective laws of history and how history moves forward, but trying to maneuver within history and within contending class forces in the world to get good things going. And this is something that is not easy. And it's something that is quite difficult. And it's something that requires you to know what other people have done. So on this stream tonight, I wanted to get into some inside baseball. I wanted to get into a little bit of Marxist inside baseball. But the reason I wanted to get into it, for the most part, is because I want to kind of put in context what we're doing with the Center for Political Innovation, why we're doing it, why certain people have reacted to us the way they've done, etc., etc. So I want to start out by telling an anecdote. There are two ex-friends of mine. There's two people I used to know. I don't speak to either of them anymore. I think they're both still living as far as I know. But they're boomers. And they were friends for a long time. One of them was a Trotskyite, a very, very dedicated, lifelong Trotskyite. And the other was a very, very dedicated, lifelong Marxist-Leninist. And they were both doing Palestine solidarity work together. They were protesting for Palestine. And they got to know each other pretty well. And they were both older, and they'd spent their life in rival political organizations, but they were doing Palestine solidarity together. They lived in the same neighborhood. And so they started going over to each other's houses for beers and talking things over, reminiscing on political events they'd both lived through, even though they weren't in the same group. They got to know each other pretty well. And one of them told me that after all this time together, one thing that they discovered was a real difference between them that was really the basis of their political differences was this. And I'm actually not going to say it because, first of all, right, it's really important to ask when someone says, I think this, right? I think that this is the case. It's really important to ask, why do you think that? And when you ask, why do you think that? Most people will follow up with, because, and they'll start making an argument for it. Well, that's an argument for it. And that might be a very strong argument for it. But that's not what we're asking. When we ask, why do you think that? What motivation led you to take this position? That's a really important question. You should ask yourself that. Why do I think this? What motivated me to investigate this political position, to learn this political position? Was I simply persuaded by this? Were my life circumstances pointing me this way? Do I have proclivities to align with this type of person? Do I feel a certain kind of empathy? Why do you feel the way you feel? That's a really important question. You should ask yourself that, and you should ask other people that. If you want to influence other people politically, If you want to influence other people politically, you ought to be able to know why you do things. I mean, you ought to know why they take positions. And in order to understand why other people take positions, you have to know why you take positions. So when you take a political position, let's say you're a big supporter of Palestine, you need to ask yourself, why are you a big supporter of Palestine? And don't start reciting dates because in this year Israel did this and the Palestinians. No. Those are all facts. But why are you? What motivated you to adopt the pro-Palestinian position? That's a fair question. What motivated you to adopt the pro-Palestinian position? So these two friends of mine, they got to know each other. Well, these ex-friends. I mean, both of them don't like me no more. But these two ex-friends of mine, they got to know each other pretty well. And they reported back to me, one of them reported back to me that they discovered the big political difference between them. Why was one of these guys who was marching for Palestine a Trotskyist? And why was the other guy who was marching for Palestine a Marxist-Leninist? What was the big difference? What differences? What was one of the biggest political differences that they had? And it came down to this. Why are Americans anti-communist? Why are Americans anti-communist? They had two different answers to that question. The Marxist-Leninist, the Stalinist, the tanky, his position was that Americans were anti-communist because of propaganda, because of lies, because of mainstream media deception. He believed that Americans were against communism because they had been lied to, because they'd been deceived, because they'd been brainwashed, because they'd been manipulated. That's why he believed that Americans were against communism. The Trotskyist, on the other hand, he believed that Americans were against communism because they saw the Soviet Union, they saw Mao's China, they saw North Korea, they saw Cuba, and they didn't like it. Well, if you think about it, that's a pretty big difference. That is a really big difference. Why are Americans against communism? Are they against it because they've been lied to and deceived, or are they against it because they saw how socialist societies really are and said, nope, I don't like that? That's a really big difference. And based on that, on a question like that, you're going to have a different orientation. If your orientation as a Marxist is based on the fact that Americans have been lied to, you are going to do everything in your power to try and counter the lies that Americans have heard. You're going to defend the socialist countries, and even the parts of the socialist countries that are weaknesses, shortcomings. You're going to do your best to highlight their achievements and to counter the propaganda and to show the American workers the truth about these socialist countries, because you believe the anti-communism that they are believing is based on lies. Whereas, if your belief is that Americans know the truth about Cuba or about Venezuela or about the Soviet Union and they just don't like it, you are going to do the opposite. You are going to bend over backwards to denounce the Soviet Union, to denounce Cuba, to denounce Venezuela, to denounce these countries, to distance yourself and say, well, socialism here is not going to be anything like this. Socialism here is going to be different. And the political differences between Trotskyites and what they might call Stalinists or Marxist-Leninists, in a lot of ways, even though this has nothing to do with Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution and Stalin's theory of socialism in one country have nothing to do with this. Has nothing to do with this, even though the Trotsky-Stalin split has absolutely nothing to do with this question. This is one of the primary differences between people in the United States who become Trotskyists and people in the United States who become Marxist-Leninists or defenders of the Stalin government. And that is a very important thing to think about. Yeah. Why couldn't Italian government count on support of military forces? All right. That's a pretty big difference. That is a really, really big difference. And examining these kinds of questions, I mean, when it gets down to it, I tend to agree with my Marxist-Leninist friend. My Marxist-Leninist friend believed that anti-communism in the United States was based on propaganda. And he's right. And that Americans know nothing about the Soviet Union. And Americans know nothing about Cuba or Venezuela. They've just been spoon-fed lots of deception and propaganda. And that is the overwhelming truth. And so I lean towards my Marxist-Leninist friend. But, and this may sound like heresy to somebody, but you got to be realistic. Life was very hard in the Soviet Union. And in the 1990s, life was very hard in People's Korea. And in Cuba, during the special period after the fall of the Soviet Union, life was very hard in Cuba. And there could be an element of truth in the fact that the countries that have built socialism around the world have done it based on a very low level of development. These are countries that have been kept poor by imperialism. And they broke free. They broke the chains of imperialism. And with socialism, they created universal health care and they raised people out of poverty. They electrified the country. They industrialized. But the imperialist homelands do offer, for the most part, a higher standard of living than most socialist countries. So, under such circumstances, you can see, well, some workers who don't understand politics and some workers who don't understand context might look at the Soviet Union, might look at Cuba, might look at North Korea and say, wow, we have fancier cars here. Wow, we have better access to food here. Wow, we have better access to the internet and computer technology here. And that wouldn't be the result of propaganda. That would be the truth. So there's an element of truth in what this Trotskyite believes, right? It's largely because of propaganda and deception that Americans are against communism. But there is an element of truth that the countries around the world that have broken out of imperialism and set off on a course of independent development with socialist methods, that often and almost always their level of development is lower than the imperialist homelands, the centers of the global financial capitalist system on the one hand. And on top of that, because they've been under attack and fighting for their lives and facing blockades and bombardment, these socialist countries are often very militarized and authoritarian. They don't have the luxury of having a completely open and, free society where anyone can say what they want. They're under the gun, they're fighting for their lives, and they have a much more authoritarian political setup. So there's an element of truth in what that Trotskyite was saying. There's an element of truth in that. But at the same time, it takes political sophistication to understand that. And this is really, really important. This is really, really important. Now, coming up at this national gathering we're having, there's going to be, the way it's going to work is there's going to be some classes on the first day that I'm not giving. And then I'm going to give classes on the second day. And then we're going to have some more classes from some guest speakers and members of the CPI, but friends that are going to be giving presentations on the third day. But, there are a couple people that are going to be speaking about Trotskyism and the CIA and the synthetic left. And so, I'm on here talking. I'm going to talk about that a little bit tonight, but I don't want to steal their thunder too much. I really don't want to steal their thunder too much. So I'm going to try to talk about it in ways I haven't talked about it before. I don't want to, preempt the class that I think it's Tristan and Elizabeth are giving at the retreat. But at the same time, I do want to talk about this topic. So, when we talk about the neocons, the neoconservatives, many people point out these neoconservatives, that are big. It's the main school of U.S. foreign policy. The neocons, John Bolton and others, that the neocons, a lot of them have a history with Trotskyism. And many times on these lives, many times, I've been asked about that history. Why is it that many of these neoconservatives have Trotskyite roots? And on top of that, many people have asked me, what about the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America? Where did they come from, right? The DSA. What the hell is the DSA? Well, they both get back to this book, The Struggle for a Proletarian Party by James Cannon. James Cannon was the leader of the American Trotskyist movement. And in 1939, there was a major split in Trotskyism. The U.S. Socialist Workers' Party, which was the main Trotskyite organization in the United States, had a break. There was a big split in the Socialist Workers' Party. And why did the split happen? Well, I'll sing you the song. Up in Moscow, in the Kremlin, in the fall of 39, there's a Russian and a Prussian writing up the party line. Leon Trotsky was a Nazi, and we knew that for a fact. Pravda said it, and we read it until the Stalin-Hitler pact. Now old Trotsky, once a Nazi, that was then the party line. But now the Nazis are hotsy-totsy, and Trotsky's laying British mines. That was a song that was made up by Trotskyites to mock the 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. 1939, the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with the Nazis. And they signed it because they had wanted to have a non-aggression pact with the United States, and the United States had said no. And they wanted to have a non-aggression pact with the British, and the British had said no. And they had briefly had a non-aggression pact with the Germans, and the Germans, or with the French, and the French had briefly had one, and then they said no. So after the Soviet Union had seen like a pending attack coming from the Nazis, they'd seen it coming, and they felt like they had no choice, basically. They said, okay, the Nazis are planning to attack us. We've tried to form a military alliance with all the Nazis' enemies. They won't do it, so I guess we'll sign one with the Nazis. So in 1939, the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler. So when they signed that pact, U.S. mainstream media went into overdrive, equating the Soviet Union with the Nazis. Time magazine started calling the Communist Party USA the communazis, right? And you know, it was all how awful the Soviet Union was. They signed a pact with Hitler. This proves they are not really anti-fascist. The communists have been running around saying anti-fascism, and look, now they signed a pact with Hitler. They're a bunch of hypocrites, blah, 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 blah. That was the mainstream media. And at that point, the Trotskyites, they still supported the Soviet Union. Not completely, but they said that the Soviet Union was what they called a deformed workers' state. They said the Soviet Union was a deformed workers' state. And, you know, even though the leaders, they didn't like Stalin, they didn't like the leaders of the Soviet Union, they said the economic foundations of the Soviet Union were still socialist. However, a group of people in the Socialist Workers' Party, a group of Trotskyites, didn't agree with that. And they were called the New York Intellectuals. And they were led by Max Shachtman. And there was James Burnham and Martin Aburn. It was Aburn, Burnham, and Shachtman. And those were the three leaders of the opposition in the Socialist Workers' Party. And they said that the fact that the Soviet Union would sign a pact with Hitler proved that the Soviet Union was not a workers' state. That was their position. The Soviet Union couldn't be a workers' state because it signed this pact. And so they announced that they no longer supported the Soviet Union. And they were for neither the Soviet Union nor the Western capitalist countries. They were for the third camp. You hear all this talk about campism? Ring any bells? Campism. Well, that's what they claimed they were for. They were for the third camp, the magical third camp. And so Irving Kristol and Irving Howe and Max Shachtman and James Burnham and Martin Aburn, a lot of these people, they broke with the Fourth International and the formal Trotskyist movement, and they started their own socialist group. And it is from that grouping that we get the neoconservatives. Now, I'm going to wave a lot of books around tonight because I've done years of research on this. And this stuff is important. This book here, this is The Prophet's Children, Travels on the American Left by Tim Woolforth. And Tim Woolforth was a Trotskyist. He was part of the anti-Vietnam War movement. And in the 1950s, when he was a young man in his early 20s, he joined the Shachtmanite group. He joined the Shachtmanites during the 1950s, during McCarthyism. He joined the Shachtmanites. And he tells the story, and it's kind of amusing, that, he went to a small college in Ohio. He's from Ohio, just like me, and it was the 1950s, and he was at a small college. And at the small college he went to, that was a pretty decent school, there were two members of the Max Shachtman Independent Socialist League. That was the name of the Shachtmanite Trotskyists. They were called the Independent Socialist League. And he tells the story that it was a scandal in local media that there were members of the Independent Socialist League at his college because it was McCarthyism. And even though these were Trotskyites, even though they hated the Soviet Union, didn't matter. It was a scandal. Dum, 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 local college has Marxist members. And so these two people, this like brother and sister that were in the Shachtman group, they like gave an event. They did a Q&A at a church. Like, yes, we are Marxists. Yes, we hate the Soviet Union. And the atmosphere at that time was they got up and they said, yeah, we're against the Soviet Union. Yeah, we're Marxists, but we hate the Soviet Union. And, the atmosphere was like, of course they say that because commies are lying tricksters. Like, it didn't matter, right? That's how anti-communist and fanatically anti-communist the USA was during the McCarthyist period. These people were vehemently anti-communist. It didn't matter, right? Because they still called themselves Marxists and socialists. They were held in suspicion, and the FBI was trailing them and all of this. So going to this small college in Ohio, and there were two people on his campus that it was big news that they'd been in part of this socialist group. He decided that he would join this socialist organization. So he joined the Shachtmanite organization. And he describes what it was like, the Shachtmanite organization. And he describes, a small office in New York City near Union Square with a lot of pamphlets. That they would have speeches every Friday night. It was almost like church, right? They'd go there every Friday night to the party forum to hear speeches on world events. And then the next night they would have a social where they'd be playing music and they would dance and people would drink alcohol. And it was just this little social club for old Trotskyites, in New York City in the 1950s. And they were against all the socialist countries. And a lot of them were involved in labor union organizing. And they were anti-communists and they hated the Communist Party. They really hated the Communist Party. And they were the Shachtmanites. And he describes how one of the main young people that was with them, Max Shachtman, was this older guy, this old trot who'd been in the Communist Party when it started. But there was a young guy in the Shachtmanite group. This is Mike, Tim Woolforth describes this. He lived it. There was a young guy named Michael Harrington. Do people know the name Michael Harrington? Well, Michael Harrington was a young kid, college-aged kid in the 50s of Irish heritage, grew up as an Irish Catholic, got interested in socialism, and he was the student of Max Shachtman. And he was there working at the office. And it was this group, this tiny little group, 30 or 40 people would meet every Friday and Saturday, Friday for speeches, Saturday for a dance. And that was the Shachtmanite organization. And he said the Shachtmanite organization was very small and it was very isolated. It was just a little sect. But the one thing that stood out about the Shachtmanite group was that the Shachtmanites were against all socialist countries. And they claimed that they were for the third camp. And so when the war in Vietnam started to escalate, they couldn't be for the National Liberation Front of Vietnam. They couldn't be for Ho Chi Minh because he was a Stalinist. He was part of the Soviet Empire, the Soviet capitalist imperialist. But they also claimed to be Marxists and Leninists and Trotskyites. So they couldn't support the USA. Right? They couldn't support U.S. imperialism. So they had to figure out, who are we going to support in Vietnam? And it's really funny. In this book, he describes how they went to the library and they did all this research. Who can we support in Vietnam? We can't support the Stalinists, can't support Ho Chi Minh, but we also can't support U.S. imperialism. So who do we support? Who can we possibly support? Who can we support? And so they found a group of Roman Catholic people in Vietnam that were against the United States and were against the Soviet Union. And so that's who they supported. And they would publish in their newspapers statements by this Roman Catholic group. And that was what they did. And every conflict in the world, whether it was Guatemala, where there was a U.S. coup in 1953, everywhere in the world, they would go and try to find somebody who was against both sides to be the magical third camp, right? So that they wouldn't be supporting the Soviet Union, wouldn't be supporting the Marxist-Leninists, and wouldn't be supporting the United States. But the joke was on them. The joke was on them. Because it's been revealed that this group in Vietnam that was denouncing the United States, this group of Roman Catholics in Vietnam that was denouncing the United States and denouncing the Soviet Union, was being covertly funded by the CIA and had ties to Franco's government in Spain. It was false. It wasn't third camp. It was an anti-communist, kind of fascist group, but to maintain their credibility, they denounced the United States. And that's generally how these things work. When there's a war going on in a country between two sides, it is very difficult to sit there and denounce both sides. You can't do it. It's not very easy to do. You'll notice that in the U.S. Civil War, Abraham Lincoln did not denounce. Abraham Lincoln was supported by Marx. And there were abolitionists who thought that Abraham Lincoln didn't go far enough. And in fact, Abraham Lincoln, in 1864, Abraham Lincoln ran for president of the United States during the Civil War. Did you know this? 1864, the USA had a presidential election. And McClellan, the Democrat who ran against Lincoln, he ran on a platform of peace with the South. He wanted to sign a treaty and let the South secede from the United States and keep slavery. And Lincoln ran on a platform, he said, don't change horses midstream, meaning I'm the guy at the head of the war. It'll ruin the war effort if you vote for the other guy, so vote me back into office. Abraham Lincoln said, don't change horses midstream. There was another party. There was a third party in that election called the Radical Democratic Party, the Free Soiler Party. And they were abolitionists who thought Lincoln was a sellout. They said Lincoln is not a real abolitionist. He's not fighting the South hard enough. He's a phony. He's compromising with the South. Lincoln's a phony. And the Radical Democratic Party, they were called, the Free Soilers, the more radical abolitionists, they ran against Abraham Lincoln in the 1864 election. Now, Karl Marx was vehemently opposed to slavery. And Karl Marx was a socialist. And you can bet that if Karl Marx, if you asked Karl Marx, who did he agree with the most? Who would his platform agree with? Marx probably agreed more with the Radical Democratic Party, with the Free Soilers, than he agreed with Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans. But Marx did not endorse the Free Soilers. He did not endorse the Radical Democratic Party. He endorsed the Republican Party. He endorsed Abraham Lincoln because there was a war going on. The Democratic Party was the party of the South. The Republican Party was the party of the North. And there was a war going on. And the Radical Democratic Party was not a factor. Right? Marxism is based on the concept of dialectics, contradiction, that history is driven forward by clashes. And if you were in Vietnam in 1960, you couldn't be against Ho Chi Minh and against the United States and be a significant political force. And that a lot of these third camps that are invented are diversions. They're diversions. They're spin-offs. They're NGOs. They're attempts to engage in infiltration and manipulation. That these Catholics who were against communism but also against the United States were a mechanism for putting out anti-communism and mobilizing opposition to Ho Chi Minh and mobilizing opposition to communism in Vietnam among people around the world who might not be sympathetic to the United States. And third camps generally don't exist. When there's an active war in a country, there's often criticism and disagreements within one camp. There's often aspects of one side that are contradictory, but at the end of the day, when there's a war going on, there generally isn't a third camp. But third camp Trotskyism is premised on the idea that there's a third camp, that you can be neutral. But the history of third camp Trotskyism is further confirmation that you can't, because Michael Harrington ended up serving in the administration of Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson was elected president in 1964. And Michael Harrington wrote this book, The Other America, about poverty in the United States. And Lyndon Johnson and people in the Johnson administration quoted Michael Harrington in their speeches about the need for a war on poverty. And pretty soon, Michael Harrington ended up serving in the administration of Lyndon Johnson. Imagine this, a Shachtmanite Trotskyite served in the administration of Lyndon Johnson. And Michael Harrington started supporting the Vietnam War. And when the Bay of Pigs invasion happened, remember the Bay of Pigs invasion? Max Shachtman, even though he claimed to be a third camp Trotskyist, he supported it. It was a rebellion against Stalinism. And if you look over the course of the Cold War, they couldn't do it during McCarthyism. They couldn't do it, couldn't do it during McCarthyism. But what the New Left was largely about was creating a mechanism through which you could say, I believe in socialism. Through which you could say, I'm opposed to the racism of U.S. society. Through which you could say, I support labor unions, and I think Marx had a lot of good ideas, and still support U.S. imperialism. That's what the New Left was about. That's really what it was about. Michael Harrington is considered the ideological father of Democratic Socialists of America. Little known fact. He has a book called Socialism by Michael Harrington. And I believe I have it here somewhere. Socialism by Michael Harrington. And it's actually dedicated to Max Shachtman. And DSA is largely a vehicle that comes out of third camp Trotskyism. It's fascinating stuff. Fascinating stuff. Now, I've talked on here many, many times about the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And this is a book about it. Francis Stoner Saunders, right? Sophie from Mars thinks it's all made up, never happened. It's all just this anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. No, it's a pretty well-documented fact, the CIA and the Cultural Cold War, that starting in the 1950s, the CIA started hiring the Shachtmanites. Irving Howe, who was another very prominent Shachtmanite, who was a founder of Democratic Socialists of America. He started writing for a CIA-funded publication called Partisan Review. But there was another Shachtmanite Trotskyist who also started working. He actually became the director of the Congress for Cultural Freedom program. And who was he? He was Irving Kristol. Irving Kristol, just like Irving Howe, just like Michael Harrington, just like Max Shachtman, he was a third camp Trotskyite. But he came all the way over to being a neocon because he was against the Soviet Union. And in the Reagan years, he saw Jimmy Carter as being soft on the Soviets. And he liked Reagan because that Reagan was going to stick it to those Soviet commies. And this is very much how you can understand where the neocons came from. The neoconservatives, DSA, they are proof that you can't really be a third campist. When there's an active war in the world, like there is right now in the Donbass region, like there is in Syria, when there's an active war going on between U.S. imperialism and its enemies, you can't be the third camp. And people that try to be the third camp generally just end up becoming more or less a soft, deceptive vehicle for the other. And you can resist that all you want, but it's the reality. And this is something that if you study the history of Marxism, becomes very, very apparent that you can't be a third camp Trotskyist. You can't be a third camp, third positionist. You can't do it. When there's two forces going on, there's two forces clashing with each other. That's the reality. But that leads me to another point that I want to make. Because, this understanding that you can't be part of a third camp, that's the basis of Marcyism, right? Sam Marcy was a Trotskyist, but he was a Trotskyist who understood that Trotskyism was largely turning into a vehicle through which anti-communism could be pushed in the name of socialism. And he was somebody who, despite having been in the Communist Party, having quit the Communist Party, he defended the Soviet Union. And so the Workers' World Party and the Party of Socialism and Liberation, they came out of Trotskyism, but in 1959, they broke with the Socialist Workers' Party, and they said the opposite. They said, in the name of Trotskyism, we are going to defend the Soviet Union. We're going to defend Cuba. We're going to defend Vietnam. We're going to defend China. They are a section of Trotskyism. As Trotskyism was becoming this third camp movement, they veered in the pro-Soviet side. Sam Marcy wrote a document, the Global Class War, the Global Class War and the Destiny of American Labor. He wrote a document, I believe, called his grouping in the SWP and the Socialist Workers' Party was called the Global Class War Tendency. And the Marcyites were a wing of Trotskyism that veered in a pro-Soviet direction. And Sam Marcy, throughout his life, he wasn't a very good trot. And I talk about this in the pamphlet here. I talk about Marcyism and how Sam Marcy was not a very good Trotskyist, right? I'm sorry, but it's like he did not really believe that you should denounce socialist countries for being quote-unquote undemocratic. He did not really believe that the focus should be on demonizing the Stalinist bureaucracy. This is a picture of Sam Marcy that I include in the pamphlet, right? And that right there, that's the flag of North Korea. You see that? All right, that's Sam Marcy right there speaking at a meeting, and then it says billionaires profit off workers' blood, Labor Committee of Yoff. There's the flag of North Korea, right? I mean, Sam Marcy, here he is with Fidel Castro. He's sitting down with the leader of a Stalinist socialist country, right? He's sitting down. He's having a face-to-face meeting with Fidel Castro in 1993. Again, that's not very Trotskyist, right? He should be trying to overthrow the Stalinist bureaucracy. He should be denouncing the Soviet leaders, but that wasn't Marcy. But the more you look into Sam Marcy's life, Sam Marcy officially left the Communist Party USA in 1934. The reason he left the Communist Party USA, we are told, is because of the fact that Hitler took power in Germany and he felt that the Communist Party had failed. The Communist International had failed to defeat fascism in Germany. That they should have had an uprising when Hitler took power. They should have had a civil war or an armed uprising. That they had bungled the situation. And that's what Trotsky said. But if you really get to know the essence of Marcy, if you really talk to people who knew Sam Marcy, that wasn't the real reason. That was not the real reason Sam Marcy left the Communist Party. The reason that Sam Marcy left the Communist Party, the real reason, was that Sam Marcy was from Ukraine. He was from Ukraine. He was not born in the United States. He was an immigrant. He was born in Ukraine. And he was Jewish. And the Communist Party in the 1930s was really trying to look more, quote unquote, American. It was trying to play up how American it was. They picked two white dudes to be their leader. Earl Browder from Kansas, the man from Kansas, and William Z. Foster, an Irish Catholic guy from Philadelphia. And even though the majority of the Communist Party's membership were not born in the United States, a lot of them didn't even speak English. Most of them were of Jewish heritage. Most of them were from different countries. A lot of them were African American. The Communist Party was really trying to play up the idea that they were not a foreign party. that they were an American party. And Stalin was telling the Communist Party of the United States, you are never going to be a serious party if you don't try to show people that you're not a foreign party. And so you had a lot of people like Sam Marcy. Sam Marcy had a thick accent. English was not his first language. He spoke Russian in his household growing up, spoke Russian and Yiddish. And the Communist Party wasn't going to make him the leader. They were not going to make him the leader because of the fact that he didn't look, quote unquote, American. And for Sam Marcy's entire life, he was bitter about that. And he said that the Communist Party was tailing reaction. They were pandering to reaction. And he complained William Z. Foster had moved the headquarters of the Communist Party from New York City to Chicago. And Sam Marcy complained about that. He said, that's bitter, right? You know, New York City is a more multinational city, but Chicago is in the heartland. And, oh, that's pandering to reaction, right? And that Marcy had this bitterness against the Communist Party for the fact that they had tried to get out of the movement to the masses. That was his whole critique. He couldn't stand the fact that the Communist Party had tried to get to the masses. And that even though he was a brilliant writer and a brilliant speaker and a brilliant organizer, he'd organized the laundromats, he'd been the leader of the Young Communist League of Brooklyn. He became a lawyer. I mean, he was this brilliant guy. They were not going to promote him. They were not going to put him forward because he wasn't, quote unquote, American enough. And that brings me to another point. All right. This is a very good book. Black Radical by Nelson Peary. Nelson Peary is one of my most favorite writers. Nelson Peary, he wrote another very good book that I have up here, The Future is Up to Us. But Nelson Peary was in the Communist Party as well. And he describes how the Communist Party was very, very authoritarian. And it was out of necessity. It was a group of thousands and thousands of people that were poor and hungry. It was the party of poor and hungry immigrants. That's really what the Communist Party was. It was low income, hungry immigrants from Eastern Europe, from Italy, from Ireland, who worked in factories, long hours, and faced discrimination on the job, and organized unions to try and get food, and rioted, had bread riots so they could eat. It was the party of desperately poor people. And in a lot of cases, the Communist Party was very much an entity that was, that they ate because of the Communist Party. At one point, they did a survey that, apparently during the 1930s, 1 in 3 members of the Communist Party got their income from the party in one way or another. A lot of times, a lot of party members sold the Daily Worker, the communist newspaper, in order to eat. Did you know this? I mean, during the 1930s, a lot of the members of the Communist Party, what they did in order to eat was they walked up and down the apartment buildings and the streets of New York City selling the Communist Party newspaper so they could eat. It was the Great Depression. People were literally starving to death. And the Communist Party was a group of people that were desperately poor and starving to death and were going out and they said, don't starve, fight. And that was their slogan, don't starve, fight. And they organized hunger marches and bread riots. And they organized veterans to occupy the Capitol, demanding veterans' benefits. Next time you see a veteran who's bashing communism, tell him you wouldn't have your benefits if it weren't for the communists who occupied Washington, D.C. with the bonus army in 1931, who won your benefits for you. But the communists were a party of desperately poor people. And that when people are desperately poor, and when people's incomes depend on something, room for debate starts to fade away. And it becomes much more of a top-down structured thing. And if you read the history of the Communist Party, you read about J. Lovestone and his fight with William Z. Foster. You read about Earl Browder and his efforts to marginalize William Z. Foster. You read about Gus Hall and how he rose up the ranks in the 1950s. And you read about all of this. There was a lot of sucking up to Moscow. There was a lot of trying to outdo each other and get Moscow's blessing. And there was a lot of authoritarianism. And on top of that, the FBI and the government was on top of them, especially in the 1950s. The FBI and the government was coming down on them as hard as possible. And so on top of that, they were constantly having their members arrested and constantly, facing government repression, etc. And so in that atmosphere, just like the Soviet Union, in the atmosphere that it was in, the Soviet Union became a rather authoritarian place. Over the course of the 1920s and 30s, the Communist Party became a rather authoritarian group. Became a group where there wasn't much room for debate, not much room for discussion. What they called democratic centralism, which is a mechanism through which Lenin invented, through which parties, could function and march as one. Democratic centralism became the vehicle through which the Communist Party very much became a follow the leader. And if you don't like what the leader says, get out. It became that kind of a place. It's too bad. And the story that's in this book that Nelson Peary tells, Nelson Peary tells the story of 1948. Tito is the leader of Yugoslavia. And he, as a member of the Communist Party, went to the state convention. He went to the state convention of the Communist Party in Minnesota. And the state convention, there's hundreds of people there because the Communist Party was a big group back then. At the state convention, they're passing resolutions. They have a resolution to honor Stalin, unanimous. They have a resolution to honor Dimitrov of Bulgaria, unanimous. They have a resolution to honor the anti-fascist fighters of Greece, unanimous. Then they have a resolution to honor Tito, the leader of socialist Yugoslavia. And he raised his hand and said, I actually think that Tito of Yugoslavia, I think that he's a revisionist. I think he's a Browderist. I think that he goes against the Marxist-Leninist line. The room goes silent. Dead silence in the room. And then the leader says, all right, well, we're going to vote on it. And so they vote, all in favor. Everyone else votes yes. And he abstained. He said, I abstain. He gave an abstention. And after that meeting, he walks out of the hall and they took him aside. The party leaders took him aside and they said, we don't really think the party's right for you, Mr. Peary. We don't think you really get what the party's about. And they're getting ready to kick him out of the party because he voted wrong, because he didn't vote to honor Tito. But then, the next morning, the Daily Worker, the communist newspaper, comes out. He gets it. The headline is, Stalin denounces Tito. And so they look at him like he must be a genius. And he walks in and everyone's applauding for him. Yeah, he knew it. He knew it. Yes. And they assumed he must have had inside information. He must have somehow known that Stalin was getting ready to denounce Tito. So he became a leader. They voted him. They elected him to the National Committee or something because he had voted that way. That's kind of a funny story that he tells in this memoir. But it points to a bit of an organizational problem. Somebody should have been able to get up and denounce Tito without being kicked out of the party. And Sam Marcy should have been able to be a prominent leader of the Communist Party despite being foreign born and having a thick accent. Right? That this is the problem. One thing I've always liked about the Communist Party of the United States is that they always had a level of political professionalism. And this is why I've studied William Z. Foster's writing so much. I've studied Gus Hall's writing so much. Is that the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union existed, fell in 1991, but it was around a long time. And the Communist Party of the United States was always held to higher standards. It was always held to higher standards because they were aligned with the Soviet Union. And so their literature and their writing and their speeches and their books that they published and their election platforms always seemed a little bit more serious than other leftist groups. They were held to standards of political professionalism by the Soviet Union. If you read the platforms of the Communist Party, if you read Twilight of World Capitalism by William Z. Foster and his message about a peaceful road to socialism, if you watch Gus Hall's campaign ads from the 1970s when he was running for president, 1968, 1972, this is a much more serious organization. Because there is a global communist movement, because there's a Soviet Union, the Communist Party of the United States, they can't act like a silly group of Trotskyites. They can't act like a bunch of crazy LARPers waving guns around, you know? They had to sound like they were a real political party. And as small and isolated and pretty much post-1950s, they were pretty irrelevant. They still had to pretend they weren't. They still had to produce documents that seemed like a real political party. And that is very admirable. And that is what makes them special. Right? The Communist Party of the USA would never publish a book like this. Right? This is The History of American Trotskyism by James Cannon. It's a good book. It's interesting, but The History of the Communist Party by William Z. Foster, compare it to The History of American Trotskyism. Right? The History of the Communist Party by William Z. Foster is a brilliant academic work. He goes over the history of different organizations. He goes over the history. The History of American Trotskyism by James Cannon, it's performance art. It's a series of speeches that James Cannon gave before meetings of the Socialist Workers' Party. And it's full of personal anecdotes. It's full of jokes. It's entertaining. It's amusing. You know, and he's telling, it's like an oral tradition. He's telling the history of their party, and this is what we did in this year. And I remember I was hanging out one time and I spoke to this guy, and this is how he said it. But it's not professional. It's a cult of personality, right? This is a cult of personality. This is James Cannon, the big trot, giving you his monologue one-man show of the history of communism in America. The history of American Trotskyism. This isn't professional. This is an ego trip. This is one man giving you his personal reflections. And it's very entertaining, and there's a place for it, but it's not how a real party talks, right? The Democratic Party doesn't publish the history of the Democratic Party and they have John Kerry or Barack Obama get up and, do one-man comedy shows. No, if the Democratic Party is going to put out the history of the Democratic Party, it's going to be like William Z. Foster's history of the Communist Party. It's going to be an academic work that's very carefully researched, that has quotes from actual documents. It's not going to be about people's opinion, people's anecdotes. It's not going to be full of jokes and all of that. That's not what it's going to be. Right? It's going to be professional. And that's one thing I always liked about the Communist Party, is that they seemed like, despite the fact that they weren't, right? Really, from about 1956 onward, they really were not a real political party. They were a fringe leftist group. But at one point, they were a real political force. In the 1930s, you bet, during the Roosevelt administration, they mattered. They were a big deal, and they ran New York City. I'll tell you that much. Earl Browder, if Earl Browder said jump, things got done. They ran New York City. They ran the docks of San Francisco. They ran, the labor movement. They had a lot of influence in the labor movement. But after McCarthyism and then after Khrushchev's secret speech, they became very irrelevant, and they became a fringe group. Now, briefly in the 70s with Angela Davis, Gus Hall, amid the political crisis of the 70s, you could say they were kind of relevant again, but not really. But the Communist Party, really, they were never a real political force, but they had to act like it. And that's what we can learn from. They would never put out a book like this, right? Or if they did, it would be by one member, and it wouldn't be an official history of the party. It would be, Gus Hall's memoirs. I think they do have a book called Working Class USA. That's Gus Hall's memoirs. But they always aspired to be a more serious political party. And that's what I like about the Communist Party. And that's what I think we can learn from the Communist Party. And that's why I'm disappointed by the Communist Party. The attacks that the Communist Party has made on the Center for Political Innovation are very uncharacteristic of the Communist Party. They didn't used to do that. People used to joke. I think, David Rovix, who's the musician who's going to be playing at our CPI retreat, he has a song making fun of different communist groups in the United States called the Vanguard, called I Am the Vanguard. One of the lines, he says, the CP will just do their thing and pretend the others don't exist. The Communist Party was like that. They had the attitude, they said, we're the real deal. We're the real party. Other parties don't exist. They didn't care, right? They weren't publishing books about the evils of the Trotskyites. They weren't publishing books about the evils of the Maoists. They pretended the other parties didn't exist, right? They were the real deal. They were the Communist Party. And they did expel people a lot. The Communist Party was notorious for expelling people for all kinds of reasons, right? If you talked to another member about party issues and not at a party meeting, they said you were guilty of factionalism. They expelled you, right? If you were caught, having a group of party members over to your house and they could argue it was a faction, right? You were forming a faction, they might kick you out, right? They were notorious for kicking people out very liberally, right? If you did anything that they didn't like, they would expel you. And they expelled people quite a bit. They expelled people a lot. But they had this professionalism about them that they didn't acknowledge other groups. They didn't acknowledge other groups. They didn't talk about other parties. Maybe they made fun of them a little bit, but that was only internal. That was not how they operated. But now they're talking about the Center for Political Innovation on official party accounts. They're talking about us. Concealio is not only going to win. Okay. All right, writing it down. But they didn't talk about other parties, and they put out material that was more professional. That's how they used to operate. And despite all the Communist Party's problems, voting for the Democrats, etc., they always kind of acted like they were better, and they didn't do that. But now they're putting out statements denouncing the Center for Political Innovation. They're tweeting out weird gossip and rumors. They're having paranoid purges. Next thing you know, they haven't done this. I'm not accusing them of doing this, but, next thing you know, every new member who's going to join, they're going to hook you up to a polygraph, machine and say, have you ever heard of Caleb Maupin? Have you ever heard of Haas? Okay, he can join. It's getting so stupid. It's getting so stupid. And, with all due respect to Haas and the infrared community, I don't think it's possible to take over the Communist Party. It's rigged, all right? Trust me. People have been trying to infiltrate and take over the Communist Party for years. The only people that have ever succeeded at it are the FBI. All right. But Maoists have tried to take over the Communist Party. Trotskyites have tried to take over the Communist Party. The Communist Party is very small. It's very isolated, and it's a small clique of people. It's their income. It's their houses. Literally, it's their apartment buildings. You're not going to be able to take it away from them. You're not going to be able to trick somebody out of their car. You're not going to be able to trick somebody out of their house and their job. And, I don't think there's any point in trying to infiltrate the Communist Party. I think the point is to act like the Communist Party should act. Do what the Communist Party is supposed to do and build the Center for Political Innovation. Do the education. Do the educational work that the Communist Party is not doing, right? And that I guess I'll just end by making a point that I've made many times, which is that a serious revolutionary movement is like an orchestra. In an orchestra, you have trombones, and you have trumpets, and you have bass drums, you have pianos, and you have violins, and you got flutes. And they're all working in coordination. That's what a real revolutionary movement is like. In a real revolutionary movement, you have people working in the labor unions, and you have people running for office on a communist platform, and you have people making alliances with other non-communist forces in strategic alliances, and you have people publishing a newspaper, you have people printing books, and you have people on the college campuses, you have people organizing rallies in the streets. You have people doing all kinds of things, all of that and more. That's what a real revolutionary party is. That's not what we have in the United States. In the United States, we got some people who play the trombone, and they sit there and they play the trombone and they say everyone else is a phony because we play the trombone. If you're a real revolutionary, you'll play the trombone. And you got some people who play the bass drum. They play the bass drum and they say, oh, everyone else is a phony. If they were a real revolutionary, they'd play the bass drum. And then you got some people who, you get it, right? All of these tiny little sects can do about one thing well. Some of them, and that's being generous, but some of them can't even do that very much anymore. But what I'm here to tell you, the reason that I continue to make this analogy is because the Center for Political Innovation is not a party. And I am repeating that over and over and over again. The Center for Political Innovation is not a party because we don't do what a party would do. If we were a party, we would be organizing in the labor movement. Now, there may be members of our group that are members of unions. There are, and they're doing great work, and I respect them. But the CPI as a group, are we an organized labor faction? No, right? I mean, the CPI, are we running people for office? Definitely not. Are we involved in election campaigns? Definitely not. Can't legally do that. CPI, are we strategically coordinating with Democrats or no? Right? Are we on the college campuses? We might have an event on a campus here. We have members that are in college, but we're not, in academia. We're not in, no, the CPI is one instrument. We are one instrument. Okay. Wrote it down. Go and lie. We're one instrument. We're an educational think tank. That's what the Center for Political Innovation is. We publish books. We publish articles. That's what we are, and we hope that as something real emerges, we will continue to play our instrument in coordination with other forces. The People's Party of Nick Brana, they're awesome. They're great. I love what they're planning to do, right? Jackson Hinkle and Haas, I love what they're doing. I love what Chris Smalls reads William Z. Foster. We've been pushing William Z. Foster. If there's one thing that this group has done, we have pushed William Z. Foster. And now we know that one of the most prominent and effective labor leaders in the United States, Chris Smalls, has basically, we hope in some way, been a result of our work because he studied William Z. Foster. Right? We are putting ideas out there. We are striving to become a factory of ideas, to educate people about socialism, to do the work that needs to be done. That's what we're trying to do. And, we're not pretending to be the vanguard. We're not the vanguard. If we were the vanguard, we'd have people in labor. We'd have people here. We'd have people. We're not. We're an educational think tank. But we're open to work with other forces. That's what makes us different. We're not standing there and pointing at all the other people and saying, what you're doing is wrong. No, we're not doing that. If you want to focus on labor activism, that's fine. If you want to focus on running for office, that's fine. There's members of our organization who are focused in other ways, but we want to provide ideological education and build the community that will lay the basis of things to come. Because the only way socialism is going to come to America, is the balance of forces is going to change, right? U.S. imperialism is crashing and burning. The Western capitalist economy is crashing and burning. And the Eurasian alternative, led by Russia and China and Venezuela and Nicaragua and Cuba and Iran, the socialist anti-imperialist bloc is rising, is gaining strength. And as Western capitalism crashes and burns, and as the socialist countries of the world emerge, and as unrest in U.S. society solidifies, there will be a variety of different forces that will come together. And we will be part of that. I am convinced. We will be a part of what emerges. That there will be people within the power structure that will be part of it. There will be people in the military who are part of it. There will be people from the business community who see that Russia and China are offering stable economic growth and that socialism would enable, economic growth to expand. There'll be people in the business community. And the labor movement will definitely be probably the biggest part of it. And there will be a block of forces emerging in U.S. society as the crisis intensifies, as Russia and China continue to get stronger, as Western capitalism and imperialism burns. There will be a block of forces that want to break the United States out of the open international system, out of Western capitalism, and move towards socialism. That's going to happen. That's going to happen. And we're going to be part of that. But a lot more has to happen than just we can do. In order to have a revolution in a country, you need three things. This is what Lenin said. In order to have a revolution, you must have, one, a serious crisis in society, a crisis so big that even the ruling class is full of turmoil, right? Not a crisis just for the workers, not a crisis just for the middle class, but even people in the ruling class are getting angry and fighting with each other. That's the first thing that you must have, Lenin said. Two, among the people, there must be a political upsurge. There must be rebellions and protests and an upsurge of activism among the population. People have got to be saying, we're so tired of this shit. We can't take it anymore. It's got to be a moment where people say, you know what? I tried to stay away from politics, but I just can't take it anymore. I am going to figure out what's going on. I am going to figure out what's going on. I am going to get involved in politics. There has to be a moment where people cannot escape politics. And things are so bad that they say, we can't escape it anymore. We're getting political. I am starting an organization in my community. I am going out to protest. This is unbearable. So you have the crisis, and then in response to the crisis, you have an upsurge of rebellion and organizing and participation by the people. And then the third factor is you must then have a revolutionary organization, a revolutionary party that is capable of transforming that upsurge among the people in response to that crisis into a struggle for socialism. That's what you must have. So far, we kind of have the first one. That's kind of what we have. We kind of have the first one. And thank you, David. But we're heading into the second one. And eventually, my hope is that CPI can lay the educational work that can lay the basis for the third one. But we ain't there yet. We ain't there yet. And it's important that we don't get an exaggerated sense of self. I see a million of these little parties on the internet formed by teenagers who think they're the vanguard and they, we're the true Trotskyists or we're the true Maoists. No, you're not. No, you're not. Keep in mind, keep a realistic sense of self. That in order for all of this to really come down, in order for Western capitalist imperialism to really come down and socialism to emerge, a lot of things have to happen that haven't happened yet. And there are things that we can't make happen on our own. There are things that will result from the breakdown of society. But while we await this happening, we have to look at the way CPUSA has been talking for the past 50 years and learn from it. Because they're talking like a serious political party. People before profits, right? Peace, jobs, democracy, and equality, real election platforms. They're sounding like a party people could actually vote for. That's what we need to learn from them. Because when the crisis comes, and when people are looking for a way out, they're not going to vote for a group of teenage LARPers. They're going to vote for somebody who sounds like a professional, serious worker politician. They're going to vote for people who wear suits and ties. They are going to stand with forces that look like they're serious, Forces that look like they could actually run the country, not LARP and, play video games, but actually run the country. And we need to develop a core of people that understand Marxism and socialism and anti-imperialism and anti-capitalism, that look and act and talk like serious professional revolutionaries. That when a crisis comes, these are people, that working people that are desperate, that are ready to fight back, will stand behind. They don't look like lunatics. They don't look like lumpen criminals. They look like serious worker politicians. That's what we need to develop. And they talk like it. They say things like, we need a government of action to fight for working families. They have a 4-point plan to rescue the country from the crisis. That's what we need to develop. We need a core of people who sound like they might actually be able to run the country. A core of people who sound like they might actually be able to run the country, like they have actual solutions to make people's lives better, that they offer a way out of the crisis. That's what we need. We need a core, a solid core of dedicated people who know what the fuck they're doing and sound like they know what the fuck they're doing and look mature and look serious and can talk and explain these ideas coherently and can get shit done. That's what we need. And yeah, you might not be the coolest person right now. You might not be as cool as the guy with the mohawk. You might not be as cool as the anarcho skateboarder. I can guarantee you, when the storm comes, people aren't going to get behind the mohawk and the anarcho skateboarder. And they're not going to get behind the like ultra revolutionary man who hates America. They're going to get behind somebody who looks like they know what the fuck they're doing. Okay. But that said, while we look and work very, very hard to look professional, to not look like grungy, silly teenage activists, there's nothing wrong with being a fanatic. One of these clowns in the Communist Party was bragging, I'm a normal person. I play magic cards. Yeah, you can be a totally normal person and be in the party. And it's kind of funny because it's like, folks, I just want to tell you something, right? Any group of people who's going around going, we're normal, trust us, we're totally normal. Did you know how normal I am? I am a totally normal person. I'm normal. Is not normal. And not in a good way, right? So if someone has to tell you that they're normal and has to emphasize how normal they are, they ain't normal, and it's not good. But there's nothing wrong. We don't want to be normal. I'm sorry, We want to be sensible? Yes. Do we want to sound coherent? Yes. Do we want to sound serious and not deranged and childlike? Yes. But normal? No. No, I can guarantee you, folks, that if you had a heart attack, they were rushing you to the emergency room for heart surgery. And they said, you've got two choices. There are two doctors who can perform heart surgery on you. The first doctor is normal. He got mediocre grades in medical school. He's just a normal, run-of-the-mill, average doctor. But this other guy who could operate on you, he's a fanatic. He got straight A's in medical school. He's got awards from the medical profession up and down his office. This guy's a legend, an international doctor fanatic who lives and breathes heart surgery every day, who thinks about nothing but heart surgery. He has performed heart surgery thousands of times. He does it better than anybody else. Who do you want to see? Who do you want to see? Do you want to see the normal doctor when your life is on the line? Or do you want to see the fanatical doctor? You want to see the guy who can get the job done because he's full of passion and he's ready to do it and he lives and breathes and he's ready to do it. Is that who you want? Think about it. When people are in a serious crisis, they want a fanatic. They want a fanatic. They want a fanatic. While we want to look serious, while we want to look down to earth, while we don't want to focus on inside baseball like I just did for the past hour and a half, we don't want to be normal. No, we don't want to be normal. We want to be larger than life. We want to be the fanatical, serious, dedicated, passionate, serious fanatics, worker politicians who can rescue the United States from the pending crisis. That's what we want to be. And that's what we strive to be. And that concludes my opening remarks for tonight, folks. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell, and then we'll start answering Super Chat questions. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Names and locations. Going to have to look away from the webcam and at the screen in order to bring you up. Names and locations. Names and locations. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. I got QC from Los Angeles. Smash that like button. Yep. QC from Los Angeles. Cedar Park, Texas. Naples, Florida. Ryan in Oakland. Nassau County, Char Char Darling. Love you, Char Char. Richard from Woodland. Cleveland Pirate Alex. San, right? Antonio. Dylan Smal. Bendigo, Australia. David Fox. Melbourne, Clyde. Ash from CPI. Chicago. Very, very good. Neil Fraser in Hong Kong. Alexis in Rochester. Romania. Kieran from San Diego. Laura Floyd from San Antonio. Welcome, Laura. Dust James in North Carolina. San Miguel from Mexico. Naples, Florida. Carl in Tacoma, Greece, right? Cyril in Poland. Naples, Florida. Dustin Schlesinger. Joe Gale, Nassau County. Welcome, Joe. Very good. Los Angeles. Columbia, South Carolina. Welcome, Wesley. Los Angeles. Shoni. Robert from Hawaii, Kendall from San Diego, Jenny Lynn from Cincinnati, Gold Coast, Australia, Robert from Hawaii, Gina from Fort Smith, Mo and Danielle from Pomona, California, Yada Yisrael in Chicago, Gina from Fort Smith, very, very good. SLC, Salt Lake City, Utah, welcome, welcome, welcome. Good to have you here. Grant from England, New South Wales, Australia, Maupin, USA. There we go. Dario from Brooklyn, Nassau County, another Nassau County. Wow, there is another. It's like that moment in Robinson Crusoe where he sees a footprint, right? There is another. There is another Char Char. There is another, right? Dario from Brooklyn. We got Moscow, Russia. Samir, welcome, Samir. St. Petersburg, Russia. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Good stuff, folks. Carter from Duluth, Mexico, split seconds. Cincinnati. All right, everybody. Very, very good. So let's start answering Super Chat questions. Got more Super Chats? Just send it along. We'll do some Super Chats here. Thoughts on Tito's Yugoslavia? Is it more in line with what CPI wants for the USA? Well, I mean, the first thing about Tito's Yugoslavia is that, Tito broke with the Soviet Union. And in the Cold War, I mean, he denounced the USSR, right? And I think that was an act of betrayal. It was an act of betrayal, and it was not good. So that's one way in which that I'm not a big fan of Tito. But as far as the worker self-management, where each factory was autonomous and sold its good to the state, where the factories kind of worked kind of like collective farms or something. I mean, there's something to be said for that. Look, every socialist society is a mixture of state property, cooperative property, and private property, right? You're always going to have some degree of private property. Even the Soviet Union during the Stalin years, it was 92% state-run, but there was some private property, right? And that, now socialist societies work really, really hard to have a market sector. But at the end of the day, there's no magical formula. It's based on the needs of the socialist country at that time. In some socialist countries, they work really hard to have a big private sector. Other socialist countries work really hard to not have a very little private sector. And, during the 1920s, during the new economic policy in the Soviet Union, they had a very big private sector. And during the 1930s, during the 5-year plans, they got to 92% state ownership. China was almost all state run, but then you had the reform and opening up with Deng Xiaoping. I believe that socialism everywhere, the point of socialism is not the government owns everything. That's not what socialism is. Capitalism is production organized for profit. Socialism is production organized for society. If production is organized to make more capital for the capitalists, that's capitalism. If production is organized to serve public good for society, that's socialism. And in a market socialist economy, you can have a very big market sector, but you have a government that is strong enough to force the private corporations to do what's in the interest of the country overall, so it doesn't matter. Venezuela, right? The way Venezuela works, they have a very small state sector, right? The oil is government run in Venezuela, but very little other than the oil is state run in Venezuela. They don't have very many state run factories. They have a few, but not very many. But they use the oil money, the oil revenue in Venezuela is used to subsidize private businesses. So in order to get their government money, those private businesses have to do what the government central planners want them to do. And the Venezuelan government has set up worker cooperatives, right? That's one of the main things they've done. So there's a lot of, cooperatives that are technically, they're private, but they're owned by the workers, and they get a subsidy from the oil money from the government, right? So it's Venezuela, even though their rate of state ownership is quite small, is very much a state-run socialist economy. China, right? You have about 50% state ownership, state-run enterprises, but you have a very big private sector. But even though private sector, again, is controlled by the state. Socialism is when you have a government of action that fights for working families, when you have a state that is based in communities, that comes out of a popular mobilization of the people, that controls the means of production. And it can control the means of production if they're state-run. It can control the means of production if they're cooperatively run. It can control the means of production if they're private. And finding the right formula at the right time is necessary, right? Stalin, in order to build up the Soviet Union very rapidly and defeat the Nazis, in the face of an oncoming Nazi invasion, Stalin built up an almost entirely state economy. Well, other socialist societies have done different things, that it's based on the needs of the country at the time. There's plenty to learn from Yugoslavia. I don't like the fact that they cut ties with the Soviet Union and kind of stabbed the Soviet Union in the back during the Cold War. But, their economic model, they did last longer than other socialist societies. So there's probably something to learn from it. Deng Xiaoping and China, you can bet they studied Yugoslavia. So there's something to it. But there you go. All right. Reading R. Palm Dutt. Why couldn't the Italian government count on military forces to support factory occupations? I think what you're referring to is that after World War I, right? Italy was on the Allied side of World War I. But their economy was pretty bad. And coming out of World War I, Italy was having a lot of unrest and turmoil. And so there was a wave of factory occupations where the workers rose up and seized their factories. And it was a revolutionary explosion. And Italian socialists and communists were a big part of it. And it was in that context of all these revolutionary uprisings happening that the capitalist government of Italy went to Mussolini and said, all right, you can set up your Bonapartist military dictatorship because we need you to stop these factory uprisings. And I think the question the person is asking is, why would the military allow Mussolini to do his march on Rome? Because it's a capitalist state, right? This is Lenin, right? The state and revolution. Lenin lays out the capitalist state serves capitalism, right? And that ultimately the process of revolution is building a whole new state, because the capitalist state will serve the capitalists. Right? And that you need to build a working class state. You need to change the Constitution. You need to build a new military based on socialist principles. Right? And that, while we want a peaceful transition, we do want to change the nature of the state. You can't build socialism with a capitalist state. And the state, the essence of the state, is the bodies of armed men. It's the military, it's the police, it's the intelligence agencies. They are the essence of what the state is. And that building a socialist society requires not just the creation of a new economy, but the creation of a new state. Ultimately, the class power is derived from state power. And again, this is the source of a lot of distortions. In my debate with Jason, he was making it sound like, well, that means you have to have violent revolution. No, that means that we need to change the nature of the state. We would prefer that be done peacefully. But it could also, there could be a crisis where something else happens, but that's not what we want. We advocate and prefer a peaceful transition, and we emphasize that all the time. But yes, the reality is, if they're looking to set up a fascist dictatorship and overturn the rights, the people have the right to go out and defend democracy, like Abraham Lincoln did, right? The slaveholders were having a revolt against democracy, so Abraham Lincoln defended it. Right. And we believe in people's right to self-defense. You don't have to roll over and let them kill you. And so, yes, if the capitalists are looking to overturn democracy, to violently suppress people's rights, so there you go. All right. And we should be clear about that. There's a nuanced way of speaking about this, right? That no, we don't support the capitalist state. No, we don't believe the capitalist state will just roll over and allow us to create socialism. But we also don't, we would prefer a peaceful transition. All right. And we don't advocate violence, and we don't advocate a violent revolution. All right. All right. What would it take to dissolve the NED? What? Oh, the National Endowment for Democracy. I mean, ultimately, you would have to. I mean, I think it would. The NED, if I'm not mistaken, the CIA is part of the executive branch, isn't it? Isn't it part of the executive branch? So I think the president could probably dissolve it with an executive order, if I'm not mistaken. But ultimately, right, we know that the CIA is a lot more than just a government institution. It's well connected to Rockefeller think tanks, to the Ford Foundation. The CIA is connected to a whole apparatus within U.S. society that is connected to it. So it's like, again, for the president to have the power to do that and not get removed from office and not have, society breathing down his neck would require a change in relations of society. But there you go. The National Endowment for Democracy is a mechanism through which the United States subsidizes, movements and dissident activities around the world. Okay, Gonzalo Lira says that Europe will have a moment when they realize they have to come over to Russia and they'll need Russian gas and food. Well, I mean, you would hope so, because, I mean, right now, Europe is being devastated by all this anti-Russia hysteria, by the sanctions, the gas prices, and what are they getting out of it? I mean, the Europeans, they're not getting shit out of this. They're losing so much. American oil companies are benefiting. American gas companies are benefiting. American agribusiness is benefiting. But what are they getting out of it? What are the Norwegians and the Swedes and the Germans? What are they getting out of this hostility to Russia? They're losing out economically. They're being devastated economically, and they're not gaining anything. So there you go. I think he may be onto something. Why didn't the Communist Party and the Socialist Party support Black Lives Matter and instead got co-opted by the Democrats? They did support Black Lives Matter, but what they did is they engaged in tailism, right? That's what they did. They just went along with it. You wouldn't have known that they supported it. This is a great example, right, of why tailism doesn't work, right? This person is saying, why didn't the communists and the socialists support Black Lives Matter? They did, right? Read any publication. Go to the website of the PSL. Go to the website of the Workers' World Party, of the Communist Party USA. They did support it, and I supported it. But these communist groups engaged in tailism. They went there and just went, yay, we support you. They didn't inject anything new into it. They just went along with whatever was hip and trendy, right? They weren't injecting Marxism or socialism or class into it. They just went along with it. So the fact that they supported it, you're saying, and then they ended up being led by the Democrats. Yeah, because the communists, why would they follow the communists? What were the communists offering? Nothing, right? What would they gain, right? The communists weren't offering anything other than, we support you. So why would they go along with it, right? The job of revolutionaries is to support, it says in the Communist Manifesto, we must support every revolutionary movement against the existing order of things. But in all of them, we bring forward the property question, meaning that it would have been the duty of communists, if they had big communist organizations that wanted to intervene in Black Lives Matter, it would have been their duty to bring forward the property question, to go into the Black Lives Matter movement and bring forward the property question. Now, during the Black Lives Matter movement, I, as an international reporter, I did my best to do that. I didn't go anyplace. I stayed home, right, which was the right thing to do, because trust me, if they had been able to make the case that I, as this guy who works for RT, was somehow going there on behalf of Russia and stirring stuff up, they could have thrown me in jail for years, right? So it was the best thing to do that I stay the hell away from that, right? In my position, right? I didn't go report on them. I stayed home. But while I was at home, right, doing my job, reporting on them for international television, we were shut down on lockdown at the time. I did my best to insert the property question. For example, I debated against a prominent libertarian, Adam Kokesh. And you can watch, I gave a debate on the question, is police brutality caused by capitalism? And I said, yes, it is. And I debated before thousands of people on that very issue. I made videos highlighting the Black national question and the role of communists in the Black national question. And those videos, mind you, it's funny, you think that they're all woke and all of that, but my videos on the Black national question during the height of Black Lives Matter have been age restricted by YouTube. They don't want you to see that. I did videos talking about the Black Belt, talking about the Communist Party's role in the Black liberation struggle, etc. And they age restricted. They buried those videos. They don't want you to see them. They don't come up in searches. I have to go into, my videos and pull them out. They do not want you to see those videos that I made about the black national question that I did during the Black Lives Matter uprising. And I was talking about, Huey Newton, and I was talking about Mumia Abu-Jamal, and I was putting forward the history of black revolutionary movements during that and inserting that into the discourse and sharing the videos and doing what I could as somebody who was in a precarious legal situation where if I had so much as gone to one of those rallies, the NYPD would have arrested me and it would have been all over the news. Russian agent found leading Black Lives Matter rallies and burning buildings. They would have done that. You believe they would have done that. And I wasn't going to let them do that. And I knew that that's what they were planning to do. And I actually there's somebody I know through my work who actually passed on information to me and basically told me that was in the works, right? So it wasn't just that I was suspicious something like that might happen. There's somebody who I work with who's, I don't want to get into specifics, but I basically was told, if you're found at a Black Lives Matter rally, Caleb, they're going to cuff you and they're going to make it that Russia did it. So, stay away. And so I did the right thing, right? And that would have hurt the Black Lives Matter movement. How would that have helped the Black Lives Matter movement? To have some guy who met with Dugan get arrested to prove that they're all a big foreign conspiracy wouldn't have helped the Black Lives Matter movement. But that said, I did what I could do. I used my platform to support it, but also to insert revolutionary politics into it, which is what PSL didn't do. It's what the Communist Party didn't do. So, I did what I could do. I'm a white guy and I'm an international journalist who's traveled around the world and works for different TV networks. And if I had, I did what I was capable of doing. I think Black Lives Matter was a very noble uprising. The politics were lacking, but that's okay. Of course, the politics are going to be lacking, right? Other than we don't want to keep getting murdered by the police, there wasn't a unifying message. And because of that, the ruling class was able to co-opt it. That's what always happens, right? If spontaneity, if you read What Is to Be Done, great book by Lenin, What Is to Be Done, spontaneity generally gets usurped by the old system unless you can somehow insert revolutionary politics into it. So I did my best to insert revolutionary politics into it. And I'm glad that there's more awareness. I was against police brutality. Look, I was in Cleveland going to court with police brutality victims back in 2010. You can read Cleveland Scene magazine did an article about me and my important police brutality work as a communist in Cleveland. I'll post that in the chat. You can read all about how I videotaped an act of police brutality at Collinwood High School, and my name was all over the news. I'll post the article. I was like the subject of hit pieces even back then, and I was definitely a figure in the anti-police brutality movement in Cleveland. Definitely a figure. I'll post the link right here. You can read it, from the bourgeois press. They acknowledge the commies next door. It's all about the role that I played. I got, people acquitted in juvenile court because of my videos. I am definitely opposed to police brutality, and I've always done it as a communist. So there you go. There you go. There you go. Check out that article I just posted. Thoughts on Zhou Enlai. Zhou Enlai was the foreign minister of China. And he was basically the international liaison of the Chinese Communist Party. And he is largely responsible for the amazing public relations work that the Chinese Communist Party did. The Chinese Communist Party had very, very good PR. You read books like Red Star Over China by Edgar Snow that made Mao a household name, that told Mao's life story. You can read, Agnes Smedley, China's Red Army Marches. That the Chinese Communist Party in the 1920s and 30s did amazing PR. They had amazing PR. They knew how to, get reporters and international writers and journalists to really kind of admire them. And they had kind of a mystique about them that made them separate from the overall communist international trend. And Zhou Enlai was the guy who was largely responsible for that. He was kind of the guy who arranged international publicity for the Chinese Communist Party. And he did a very, very good job about that. Very good job. The other thing is that Zhou Enlai was one figure who stood up to the Gang of Four. Mao's wife and the Gang of Four, they were ruthless, just vicious, and suppressing people. And Zhou Enlai was somebody who would protect intellectuals and people being targeted by the Gang of Four. And so when he died right before Mao did. His death, his funeral turned into an anti-communist riot. You can read about the Tiananmen incident of 1976. So there you go. 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 Next question. Ralph Nader said you got to turn on to politics or politics will turn on you. Well, that's true. Yes. You know, I mean, and that is the truth, right? That if people are not involved in the political process, if they leave it up to the politicians, then bad things are going to happen, right? And that it requires people being involved in the political process, right? That's certainly true. That is certainly true. You know, and yeah. So there you go. That is certainly true. Yeah, I don't. Okay, Magic the Gathering is famously expensive. Working people, paycheck to paycheck, can't afford it. I've never played Magic the Gathering, so I don't know about that. I really don't know about that. So yeah, it's not been. It's one of those nerd hobbies, right? I mean, no offense to anyone who plays it. I just have never gotten into it. Never had the time or the interest. So there you go. But there you go. How should communists interpret the Constitution? Originalism or as a living document? Well, I'll be honest. I'm not into the cult of the Constitution. You know, black people are 3/5 of a human being. And the Constitution, I mean, has changed in a lot of ways, like separation of church and state, right? The reason that they had separation of church and state was originally because 9 of the 13 colonies had state religions. And the idea was that they could maintain their state religions on a local level. And then the federal government would have no official religion, so they could maintain their state religions. But then the Supreme Court ruled that all the rights at a federal level are de facto at the state, right? It used to be states could outlaw free speech, the federal government couldn't, but they got rid of that, right? There's been Supreme Court rulings, the Constitution has been amended, and the cult of the Constitution, that's a big thing on the American right wing. They have this, our Constitution is this sacred document, and you hear it from the left too. It's silly. It's pretty silly, right? I think in the process of socialism, it may be that we have to ratify a new constitution, which the Constitution lays out procedures to do. Did you know that? The U.S. Constitution has procedures in it to write a new constitution, for a new constitutional convention to write a whole new constitution. So in theory, we could do that. Now, it could be possible to amend the Constitution or something like that. But the Constitution is very much the result of the American Revolution. It's the result of struggle, the Bill of Rights, etc. The U.S. Constitution, it's important to understand the historical context of where it came from and why it is the way it is, right? And why do we have a Second Amendment? Why do we have a First Amendment? And these things are important, right? They're important. Why do we have these things? Why did the Constitution develop the way it did? This is all important. But the cult of the Constitution. Oh, the Constitution is... No, the Republicans, I will never forget, the Republicans, they were trying to diss Obama. And so they had this, they were going to read the Constitution, and they censored, they didn't read the whole thing because there's many things in the Constitution, like black people being 3/5 of a human being, slavery, that they didn't want to, didn't sound very good. Right. So there you go. I mean, I've read the Constitution as a political science major, as somebody who, and even in high school, I know the Constitution quite well, I would say. I know the articles and the amendments and all of that. I know all of that. But there you go. All right, folks. Well, I guess unless anyone has any more questions, I think that will be everything. So there we go. Upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.